In 1950, when painter Arthur Murch needed a notable Australian to sit for his entry in the Archibald Prize, he chose comedian George Wallace. Perhaps the most accomplished all-round talent to emerge from that turbulent era of Australian show business that went from tent shows to television. But at the time of the painting, George was at the lowest point of his professional life and about to take the biggest gamble of his career. A career that had celebrated and influenced the humour of the archetypal Aussie larrikin.
For no reason at all, I'm going to sing a song now, a very, very pathetic Hungarian love ballad entitled My Girl Works in the Bottle Works and the Boy Says She's a Corker. You wouldn't know her if you saw her, 'cause she doesn't seem to fit. I'm all excited because my girl's got it. Her hair was brown, now she's a platinum blonde, and oh, her eyes, they gaze into the beyond. I had a great big roll of money, thought that pretty I would sit, but she got her fingers on it, and now my girl's got it.
Barry Humphries, Burke and Wills, you know, or Ned Kelly, George Wallace. Why not George Wallace? You know, he was part of our history, theatrical history.
Well, there's a fellow around here by the name of the Ferret. Oh, the Ferret, yeah. That's a town in Tasmania.
He embodied what the real cheeky little chappie of an Australian was at that time.
You reckon you could train a horse?
Yeah.
Listen, you couldn't train a goat.
No?
No.
Well, one of these days I'll put the harness on you and try you out.
Put the harness on me.
He was the sharpest man with the sharpest mind. That's why he was so good at comedy.
Good morning, Miss Olsen. How are you this morning? It's been very hot and cold and wet and dry all day, hasn't it?
Yes, he had this innocence and naivety about his comedy, which, with him, could be very, very funny.
I might mention for the benefit of the younger generation that in this dance I do one of the most bonzour steps you've ever seen. It is called the Dance of the Startled Fowl and gives you a slight impression of a young white leghorn she-fowl that has just laid its first egg and frightened the hell out of herself, see? And as it's walking away, it trips over the egg. If any, all up in the laugh.
I think the thing that made the strongest impact on me was the humanity of the act. He was irresistible. He told funny stories, he did funny dances. The persona was one of the naughty boy, I suppose, and that's probably what I identified with at the time.
The naughty boy was born George Stevenson Wallace, son of Bronco and Kate Wallace in rural Aberdeen in the Upper Hunter Valley of New South Wales on June 4th, 1895.
My great-grandparents, Bronco and Kate, they had an act together. They toured the countryside doing an act, and they were very popular at the time. When grandfather was born, I think they came back to Sydney.
They lived in Pyrmont, where the bustle of the waterfront was an attraction to young George.
Show business was obviously in the genes because when he was about 4 years old, he used to go down to the wharves and he used to sing and dance for the sailors, and they used to throw him a bit of money now and then.
Bronco formed a double act with Kate's brother, but their extensive touring put an impossible strain on his marriage. Kate left him and remarried a wealthy businessman. 7-year-old George was soon presented with a half-sister, Doris.
George felt very much not a part of the family. He was made to feel that he was not welcome. His half-sister was given piano lessons, elocution lessons, things of that kind. There were no lessons for George. Anything he learned, he picked up through his own industry.
When he was 12, he worked for his stepfather at an ink and varnish factory, and it didn't really satisfy him at all.
Influenced by the writings of Henry Lawson and having gone to school with his son, George wanted to be a farmer. His stepfather arranged a job for him on a dairy farm in Bangalore on the New South Wales north coast. George soon became known in the district as a card and a character who could be relied upon at local parties for a song, a dance, and a story or two.
Well, anyhow, I got a job on the farm. And one day a pig died and we had pork for about 3 weeks. So I didn't say anything. I just carried on, hail fellow, all wet. And then another day a cow died and we had roast beef for about 2 months. And then another day old Mrs. Doyle died and I left the next morning.
As a teenager, George lived and worked in various country towns in New South Wales before moving to Queensland.
Grandad loved the north of Queensland. It really got into his blood. He worked on farms. He worked in sugar mills. He did a lot of stuff with horses. He became an accomplished horseman, marksman, and blacksmith.
At 16, he was working at the Plaistow sugar mills in Mackay in Queensland, hardly the place where you'd expect an aspiring comedian to start. But into town came a small travelling show run by a guy called Happy Harry Salmon. And George met them at the station and persuaded Harry to give him an audition. And he got the job as a comic and general dog's body. He developed his singing, dancing, acrobatic and musical skills. It was a great training experience for him. After 12 months, I think he really saw that this was his forte and he thought that this is what he wanted to do.
But once the tour ended, so it seemed, did his prospects. 19-year-old George went back to cane cutting for a living, but the urge to entertain still needed an outlet. He found it in the bar of the local pub at Walkerston, where he also found a pretty young barmaid.
He used to come to my auntie's hotel to play the piano and to sing. I got quite fond of him, and Auntie said, keep him for the business sake.
George Wallace and Rita Nichols were married in 1917 at the People's Evangelical Mission House in Brisbane. George got a steady but mundane job canning pineapples before being reunited with an old friend.
Happy Harry Salmon was starting a new tour, tracked George down and wanted to know, did he want his old job back? Could a duck swim, was George's reply.
George worked Rita into his act as his feed, and together they earned £3 a week plus their keep. George was starting to make his name as a bush comic.
Everybody said, oh, you should go to Sydney. You'd be this and you'd be that. And so I insisted that he could go to Sydney and see what it's all about.
In the optimistic days after the Great War, theatre was Australia's most popular form of entertainment. Sydney alone had more than 30 houses offering live shows. George was introduced to theatrical entrepreneur Harry Daddy Clay, who auditioned him in front of an audience at his Bridge Theatre in Newtown. George launched into the sort of routine that would become his trademark. He stopped the show with his acrobatic dance. It was just the break he'd been looking for. He and Rita were hired at £4 a week to tour Clay's circuit of suburban vaudeville houses.
Well, I was of George Wallace's feed, and he used to go mad because he'd say, you're a good looker, and I'm not. They're not taking any notice of me, they're taking all the notice of you, and he got cranky.
The act got some unkind reviews, but eventually the critic from the influential theatre magazine saw some encouraging signs. George Wallace is a comedian with a delightfully quiet style. He gets his laughs without any forcing. His wife helps in the patter. They wound up by introducing their son, George Wallace Jr., in some clever acrobatic poses.
George spun him up and held him in his hand, bounced him on one leg. He was a great success, naturally. It's a dear little kid.
At the end of the 5 weeks it took to complete the tour, Rita bowed out. The stage was George's home, not hers.
Well, I was a very nervous person on stage, and then that didn't seem to leave me. But I couldn't keep it up because I had no one to look after. Young George.
George found a new stage partner, comic, singer, eccentric dancer and baton twirler Jack Patterson. They formed the double act, Dinks and Onkus. Visually, they made an instant comic impression. Jack was a 6-footer and very thin. George was a stocky 5'4".
Harry Clay was sceptical about the teaming at first, but within a year they became the biggest act on Clay's circuit. Due to the physical nature of their act, I think they hurt each other a fair bit. George even knocked Dinks out on one occasion when he should have ducked instead of weaved. Later in his life, Dinks told me that the act largely split up because they got a little bit too rough with each other, both on and off stage.
Dinks and Onkus parted, and after only a short marriage, so did George and Rita.
Well, I couldn't hold him. I couldn't hold him because everybody was fussing him. He had so many lovely ladies after him. So he was having the time of his life. Do you blame him?
By mid-1922, George was established as one of Clay's top comics. He wrote and produced his own shows, painted scenery, wrote songs to order, played several musical instruments, and even helped groom up-and-coming talent.
When Chick and I first met Harry Clay, we were about 16 or 17, I think. He said, we'll put you with George Wallace, with his review. He's a young star that's been recognised in Sydney as one of our new and best talents, so he'll help to teach you your business, as it were. And one of the first shows I did with George was Harmony Row. They set up a comedy boxing act on stage. It was one of the highlights of the show.
I don't like him, and I'm not going to shake hands with him. You want to understand, you've got to shake hands before you fight. Come on. Come on. Oh, all right, I'll shake hands with him. It's all right with my friends. No, you haven't passed with him. I just shook hands with him.
You had to be very careful when you were boxing around with George because he was a very athletic young man indeed, and I always made sure that I didn't hurt him at all because I knew I'd get it back. He had to fight to get his recognition, they tell me, because there was plenty of opposition in those days.
Well, the comedians usually got their early experience on the Clays circuit, which was a suburban circuit with a pretty rough audience, especially the bridge there to Newtown. So if you could tame that audience, then it was considered you really had something going. And Ben Fuller, always on the lookout for artists and especially comedians, would generally then make them an offer for the circuit.
Ben Fuller ran a higher grade of presentation than Clay's, at inner-city theatres around Australia and New Zealand. George was hired at £20 a week and, well prepared with his repertoire of 15 original reviews, toured the circuit on both sides of the Tasman.
Touring with Fuller's, George became known right around Australia. Alongside their more established comedians like Roy Rene and Jim Gerald, George became one of the top attractions.
The three kings, or the three big comics, each had a different persona, which I think represented Australian life at that time. Now, Jim Gerald was the cocky larrikin, Roy Rene was the city lair, and George was essentially the boy from the bush, come to the city. Of course, there was great rivalry among these three kings, and they were anxious to know whether someone was getting more laughs than they were. And George, though I didn't detect in him any of the vicious rivalry, it was just the ego was there. It has to be there to be a star like that. But I never detected anything vicious. He was good-natured. That was his personality, and that was the persona of his comedy.
Ladies and gentlemen,
I shouldn't really be here.
Why? Where should you be? Where do you live?
I should be at town. I'm staying at the boarding house, but I really come from the country. I've been down here about 3 weeks.
Oh, that's so. That's fine.
I should be at town looking after Stanley.
Stanley? Who's Stanley, your brother?
Oh, it's our bull.
Well,
I look after him. I tend to his wants.
all right, I know nothing about your bull. Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen.
He's a Jersey.
Who's a Jersey?
Stan.
All right, forget him. Ladies and gentlemen.
5.
Who's 5?
Well, he's not 5. He won't be 5 until October. But if anybody asks us how old he is, we say he's 5, because what's a couple of months in the life of a bull?
Yes, that's quite right. Ladies and gentlemen.
He won a prize at the Gumville show. There's his certificate. His thing. He won
Oh, give it to me. You mean certificate?
Certificates, yeah.
It's only a small piece of paper.
He's only a small bull.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have here an egg. I shall break the egg into the hat. And with a few magic words, I shall make the egg leave the hat and go back to the shell.
Leave the shell, go back to the fowl.
Now, forget about it.
A good trick if we could do it.
Well, be quiet, please. Now, what's the matter? Yes, it is a bit on the turn.
On the turn? It's halfway up the straight.
By the end of the 20s, George was at the top of the comedy tree. His robust, innocent style of absurdist humour played to packed houses and glowing reviews. But the halcyon days of the Fuller and Tivoli variety circuits were brought to an abrupt end.
In 1928, the talking films had arrived.
Talkies are a great invention, we agree. Knocking isn't our intention, no siree. We used to love the good old picture show, the way we used to see them years ago.
Fuller said, you finish at the end of the show, and we're going over to talking films. And from then on, the dressing rooms were empty, but the theatres were full.
In 1929, the decline of the variety circuits was hastened by the arrival of the Great Depression. Live shows were out of most people's reach, but the talkies were cheap and offered American and British film stars.
The actors were walking around Sydney selling apples and pencils on the street corners. It was a very sad blow indeed.
George's company toured successfully, but even they felt a pinch as attendances dwindled. Charles and Chick set sail for England in search of work. George planned to follow them when his show at Melbourne's Bijou finished its run. The time seemed ripe to have a crack at international stardom, but fate intervened.
In August 1930, F.W. Thring, the father of the famous Frank Thring, the actor, set up his own independent film production company, FT Films. And of course, they did a lot of screen tests, particularly for their vaudeville shorts. They made over 80 vaudeville shorts during 1931. And one of the people tested was George Wallace.
Frank Thring at that time had never seen George Wallace, being George was a Sydney-sider and hadn't been in Melbourne very long. He arranged that George do a test, and he did. Then came down to the studio, did some tap dancing and told a few yarns.
You remember that famous Russian lady that was out here? Palmolive. No, Pavlova.
He decided that he'd hire George and signed him up in a contract for 12 months for £90 a week. My salary at that time was £3 a week as an assistant recording engineer.
George's film career was launched in grand style. Thring chose to headline him in what he described as Australia's first musical comedy feature film.
Thring recognised George's star status with the Australian public right from the start by giving George above-the-title billing in his first feature, His Royal Highness, produced with a budget of £19,000.
George brought to the film resident performers from his stage company, including Marshall Crosby and Big John Dobby. With C.J. Dennis as collaborator, George adapted his original stage review. The plot foundation of Alaric and Ozzy, made king of the mythical Batonia, was perfect escapist fare for the Depression.
Frank Thring was a director, but George was a co-director. In fact, it was his story. It was George's sketches which made the show.
Hey, your deal. wants to sit down and play cards all the time, isn't it? You know, you get away from... you get away from bound and... I said how I have before. Will you sit down and stop acting the goat, standing up all the while? Don't be such a foot... Daddy smack? I bet you'd cheat if you got the chance.
2 cards, please.
Who let that bull in you?
2 cards, please.
Tenner.
Since George's time, there have been other people who've played the larrikin in some way, but to me, George's world is still a much more innocent world, a world where there was something almost romantic about being a larrikin.
Now listen, you're not going to make me strut me stuff again, are you? Get up and go on with all this my lord business. Well, I'm not going to do it now.
It is usual, Your Majesty.
Oh, look at the hand I've got. Look, a slash. This is for me.
I'm sure the Depression years had a big effect on the stories that George was telling and the characters he was playing. There was a sense of struggle and darkness and oppression outside. They weren't inside the stories, and it certainly wasn't part of George's personality, but there was something about the act that was something like lighting up the darkness.
Mr. Thring said, now, I want you to do a skating sequence and I want you to do a lot of falls in it. He got a huge slab of concrete made and I had to skate on that so they'd get the noise of the wheels, but what he forgot was that I had to fall on it. And after the first day, I was just a mangled heap of bruises, and he said to me, there's a bottle of liniment there, you better take home and rub yourself. I said, you better fill the bath up and let me get in it.
Australian audiences flocked to see their favourite vaudeville son on the screen. Elaborate and spectacular, said the Melbourne Argus, and most critics praised both George's humour and the film's professionalism. The success of His Royal Highness completely vindicated Frank Thring's faith in George as what we'd call today a bankable star. It was one of only 3 feature films made and released in Australia in 1932. The others were FT's sound production of The Sentimental Bloke and Cinesound's On Our Selection. Each did good business establishing the box office potential of Australian pictures and launching the 30s as a golden age of Australian filmmaking. A second Wallace feature went into production before the first was even premiered.
Everything a policeman should know. Page 1, chapter 1. How to act in the case of a drunken man. If he is a small man and very, very drunk, rush up, kick him in the face, knock his hat off and arrest him. I know that one off by heart. On the other hand, if he is a large man and not very drunk and inclined to be fightable, send for a policeman. See, you can't trick yourself with this. Here's a goodie. Come here. What do you got there?
Beer, of course. What do you think it is?
Hey, listen, son, that's no way to speak to me. I'm a policeman.
You're a policeman. Get out of it.
Come here.
I suppose I was a cocky little bugger at 10 years of age, and a gentleman by the name of Frank Thring walked into the theatre, sat down, saw me and said, hey, why don't we use this kid in George's next film?
Give me that bottle. Give me the bottle. Give me it. Come here. What are your mother and father thinking about to allow you to do such a thing? You never know what may happen. You might drop the damn thing and break it.
And we didn't rehearse. He used to explain things to me. You know, we didn't rehearse, we talked. He told me what to do, and then they said, let's shoot it.
What's your name?
Leonard Kilpoppenby.
Listen, Sonny, it's not a bit of use to swear, and that's not going to do you any good.
Who's swearing?
Be quiet. I've got to warn you before I arrest you. I want to warn you out of fairness to yourself that any evidence you may lean up against you may, if you lean up, anyhow, you're going to go in, so don't argue the point.
Harmony Row broke attendance records throughout Australia and New Zealand, received excellent reviews and attracted high praise for George as a comedian equal to the best in the world. At the age of 37, George was at his peak.
You know this man?
Yes.
Yes. You know this girl?
Yes, of course I do.
What are you? Sweethearts, are you?
Yes.
Well, what the hell are you doing? Grab one another. Go on. Break. Go on, you. Hop it. Go on.
Good night, Harry.
Good night, Lil.
Good night.
Good night, Harry. Nice fella, Harry, isn't he? Inside, Lil.
Well, how was George with the ladies? Oh, boy. He was a killer. Well, I remember one instance.
Number 8.
George had gone home to have a rest because he was a bit crook. And Harry Kitchener, the manager, gave me this letter. He said, take this over to Mr. Wallace. Deliver it. I said, oh, yes. And gave me a Zach. Off I trotted, knew the room number, went up.
Hello, hello.
I walked in, and there is George in bed with a beautiful lady, one of the ladies in the show. And I said, excuse me, Mrs. Wallace, but I've got a message for your husband. And they both fell out of bed laughing.
Sometimes when I'd go down to the theatre to rehearsal with my parents, I'd see George kidding around and having fun with the girls. And I could see that they were impressed. I mean, he was a star, he had status, he had a big salary. And for young girls breaking into the business, this was very, they were very impressionable. And he also had, of course, a very good personality. George had a few lady friends over the years, but he would ask Rita for a divorce, knowing that she would refuse. And then George was sort of off the hook. So life was a breeze. I personally couldn't see the attraction, but I thought Clark Gable was lovely.
George's next film, A Ticket in Tats, was concocted around that favourite Australian pastime, horse racing. Location shooting took place at Melbourne's Flemington Racecourse and Kilsyth in the Dandenong Ranges.
We all had a picnic up there that day, and Frank Thring said better go down and get some beer, and they had a party. Everything was a party on those days when we went on location.
Good morning, Mrs. Doyle. What can I do for you?
Morning. 2 pounds of butter.
Yeah. How you been keeping, Mrs. Doyle? All right?
Fine, thank you.
That's right. 2 pounds.
Oh, how dare you, you clumsy...
Well, the grocer's shop, I mean, that was hilarious, because he had everything to play with, the sugar, the salt, the pepper. He used to sneeze all over the place and go, ooh, at the salt, and get honey and go, ooh, and those big round eyes, and he would go round and round. And he'd make dough, and then he'd make scones, and he'd throw them, he'd throw them to the stagehands. Everybody standing on stage would hit with a scone.
How you been keeping, Mrs. Doyle? 2 pounds. You'll like this flour. This is very good flour. Now, Mrs. Doyle, if you're going to play, stop acting the gun.
George masquerades as a waiter in an elaborate nightclub sequence.
Was made on the stage at Her Majesty's Theatre. The extras were society people and friends of Frank Thring's associates. The drinks were on the house, and everyone had a most enjoyable time.
In a market dominated by Hollywood fare, A Ticket in Tats did well at the box office. But other factors were at work. A fourth George Wallace film, A Sweep in the Deep, was in pre-production when Thring dropped a bombshell. He had long campaigned for a government quota system to protect Australian films against the deluge of American and British product. But when his repeated demands fell on deaf ears, he suspended all film production and took over Melbourne's Princess Theatre. Thring would devote his energies to the stage instead.
And he put on this wonderful bracket of musicals. There was Scarlet's Inn, Jolly Roger, and Beloved Vagabond.
George, still under contract to Thring, was a natural for the comedy leads in the shows. which featured elaborate sets, spectacular musical numbers and large casts.
I was in student prints at the King's. I left the student prints to go to the Princess because I was so thrilled to be working with a man like George and Gladys Moncrief.
Collett's Inn was the first big original Australian musical of its kind and scored a big hit in Melbourne and Sydney.
It was a big moment for George too. He was changing over from sort of vaudevillian comic to shows, legitimate dialogue shows. And for a comic, that must be a big, big change.
Thring saw great potential for Collett's Inn. He took off for London to lay plans for a West End season in partnership with the great producer C.B. Cochrane. It seemed a golden opportunity for George to make his mark in England.
And we were all ready to go to London for Cochrane, Gladys Moncrief, myself and some of the others. And we sold practically everything. But Mr. Thring was in London and then he got very, very ill. So we just stayed in Australia.
In a matter of weeks, Thring was dead at the age of 52. And so were the grand plans for Collett's Inn and FT Films.
He died shortly after coming back here, a cancer of the throat. And that was the demise of the film industry in Victoria at that time.
Having lived comfortably under contract to Thring for 5 years, George had to face up to a major change in his circumstances. But he took it in his stride. He hit the road.
He asked me, he said, well, we do a double act and go up north. And I used to get working some of the sketches with him. As the show would be going on, he'd call me out, see? And he said, would you want to sing a song now? I said, all right. So I'd do a couple of numbers and then he'd come back again and he'd say, listen, you want to join me while you're singing a song? He said, you sing something and I'll paint it. I said, all right. And so I'd sing Red Sails and the Sunset and he'd sit down here and as I'm singing it, he'd be painting, you know.
He was so talented. He had so many skills. I mean, he was a rough diamond, you know, with a check shirt and the belt holding up his trousers underneath his tummy. I was with him on and off in his shows for about 10 years. And one night I was running across the back of the stage and there's George bending over with his trousers down and two stagehands looking at him. And as I almost got off stage, he stood up and he said, well, did you see him? And they said, He said, well, the doctor said they're the biggest hemorrhoids you've ever seen. And I went for my life.
We used to stay together in the hotels and flats, different places. The first morning I was there, I woke up and George was awake and I said, oh, you getting up yet? He said, oh, not to lie for a while. And the cigarettes were on his table and he kept watching them and picking them up and putting them down. And then he'd get one out and he put it in his mouth. And then he lit a match and he lit it and he did the drawback. And then I heard the greatest cough I've ever heard in my life. He nearly coughed his head off. He got this big cough up and then after he got that over, and then he settled down a bit. He used to shake the building when he coughed.
Give me a cigarette, Happy. Just to steady me nerves, will you?
18 months after the collapse of FT Films, George was back before the cameras.
I'm a dragon. We're trying to learn a vaudeville act. Can you play that thing? I can vamp. Well, vamp. Not me, the guitar.
George signed a contract with Thring's great rival, Cinesound, and Let George Do It went into production in Sydney under the direction of Ken G. Hall. Hall had always loved George Wallace on stage. He described him as the people's comic, the put-upon little man, honest as the sun, who, no matter what the circumstances, could never put a foot right. The heart and soul of the Chaplin figure.
At that time in 1938, Germany was again casting a threatening shadow over Europe, and Hall had decided to fall back on the maxim that had served Cinesound so well during the Depression. When things are tough, make comedy.
Come on, now, send me a ride. Somebody pushed me.
Nobody pushed.
Somebody deliberately sneaked up and pushed me.
You slipped? How do you know you were pushed?
How do I know I was pushed? Wasn't I there when the push happened?
Oh, go and do your dance.
He used to say he used to watch a drunk for half an hour. He said, I used to learn that many different little steps, how they fell and things. I learned it all for drunks, he said.
That's the stuff, Now, I saw you that time. Now, I deliberately saw you that time.
Listen, you're mad. He never touched you.
Listen, whose side are you on? I believe it was you pushed me.
Oh, you're over here and go on with the dance.
All things come somehow, that you're nobody's sweetheart now.
Ken Hall used to be wrapped in George. He used to watch every little scene with him, and how he'd really break up laughing halfway through the scenes.
Hall, recently returned from Hollywood and keen to make use of the latest techniques, surrounded George with better production values than he was ever accustomed to in the FT days. But in the final toss, it was still George's routines that made the picture.
Clara, Mike doesn't like anyone hanging round the stage.
Who's hanging round?
You are, and you know you are.
Well, what about the way you hang round that molly?
Now listen, you've said enough. Now you mind your own business, see?
Well...
Don't whinge and howl.
Didn't you say last Christmas you'd like to kiss me under the mistletoe?
Well, I wouldn't kiss you under an anaesthetic. Fisticuffs, the flying fist.
Oh, what's that funny thing?
Now,
I got it.
With Let George Do It, Hall created the perfect vehicle for George's talents. It features gangsters, vaudeville routines and boat chases, and is generally regarded as George's best all-round film.
Hello? Keeper Wallace here. Elephant Department.
Early scenes in George's second feature for Cinesound, Gone to the Dogs, take place in Taronga Park Zoo. He played a keeper who discovers a tonic to make greyhounds run faster.
I saw a robin building a nest way the treetops high. Just like that robin, I'll build a nest.
George wrote a song, We'll Build a Little Home, which was given to the romantic leads Loy Green and John Fleeting.
And I'll build a little home for you. That's what I'll do.
I know it's true.
I was going to do that one first, but then they said it was better for the lead to sing it to the girl. George wrote another little sequence in it too. Oh, my pretty little lotus flower, how I love you every hour.
You're the one for me, my lotus flower.
Now listen, you're always singing about this lotus flower. Now, where is she?
She come one time, maybe.
Go on, play that thing. Get hot.
Me go to clown?
Yes, you go to clown. Go on.
We were sad, things were bad, now we're happy as can be. For you'll find fortune's kind and smiles on you and me. Clap your hands, shout hooray, oh, Lady Luck is calling in today. Come and join the Jubilee, we're heading for prosperity and gone to the dogs. Oh, you don't need lucky stars, the rabbit foot won't get you very far.
Come and join the Jubilee, we're heading for prosperity, gone to the dogs.
In Gone to the Dogs, George dances for the only time on film in an ensemble number. George found K.G. Hall a demanding director and complained that over-rehearsing affected the spontaneity of his comedy. But he respected Hall, and this home movie footage, taken by a honeymooning couple, reveals a relaxed George happy to mug for the cameras. despite the success of Gone to the Dogs, Cinesound's feature output ground to a halt when World War II shut the door on Australia's first golden decade of cinema. George's 5th starring feature would also be his last.
I was always a lot of fun with George. On or off stage, you know, was plenty of laughter. He said, I just bought this farm. I bought a duck and a fowl up. He said, that'll start the farm off, you know, it's a poultry farm it was. And so we all stayed up there about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I said, well, what are we going to have for tea? He used to call me the Pat. He said, the Pat will cook something up. I said, what am I going to cook? He said, the duck and the fowl. I said, that's going to start your farm off. He said, I'll start it off next week. We had some good nights around there.
Well, George was known to be a party boy. He liked to drink, and he loved the after-the-show parties, which I understand became quite wild at times. You know, young ballet girls running around in their slips and having drinks and etc.
Throughout the war years, George enjoyed a close association with his new stage partner, Bubby Allen. Together, they brightened the lives of people on the home front and entertained the troops on leave. The war had temporarily stopped the importation of theatre acts, and local performers again ruled the Tivoli boards.
When you're at the Tivoli, you used to do an afternoon show and a night show.
Yeah, 2 shows a day.
So
those days.
And then if you're going into another show, you'll be rehearsing in the mornings. So you'll be rehearsing in the morning, show in the afternoon, and show at night.
With George, his sketches would be there, and he'd let you read them, or he'd tell you about them. But the rest of it, you could ad-lib your way through if you threw in a laugh or something like that. There was no worries with him, you know what I mean?
Well, there was one sketch, as I told you, the judge. That started off as a 5-minute sketch, and it ended up a half an hour. He was terrific that way. He could build a sketch up from nothing.
During the war years, we're doing a review on the Tivoli's show called Target for Tonight. An interval, this door bursts open and in comes a well-dressed businessman. And he shakes George by the hand. George doesn't know who he is, and he's looking in the mirror, trying on George's comedy hats in the mirror, making faces. And it's worrying George, who is this man? So after a while he says, well, what are you doing for a crash these days? And the man turned round and said, he said, I'm Prime Minister of Australia. He said, I'm Artie Fadden, which I thought was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. They'd been brought up together in the Queensland days. They both worked in a sugarcane factory up there.
During the 40s, George's songwriting and publishing activity hit its peak, resulting in the creation of his most enduring composition.
We were at the Tivoli, and I can't remember who the conductor was there then, but anyhow he said George might be able to write a few lines to a song to sing. A big production number it was. They all dressed us up in the white uniforms, the same as our army men, you know, they had the khaki. I used to start off with just an old slouch hat with the side turned up. Then come a June, and then come soprano, and then come the girls. And then we used to go into the army routine with the rifles and that.
A brown slouch hat became Australia's #1 patriotic song of World War II, a perfect expression of the pride of a nation in their soldiers in uniform.
George was the perfect choice when director Charles Chauvel wanted to inject some humour into his morale-boosting film about the Western Desert Campaign, The Rats of Tobruk.
Remember me, you know? Through the window?
Yeah. And all that up like a plate of
Yes. Yeah.
What's your night on?
Listen, it's come at last. I'm going to Greece.
Looking noticeably older and larger than when audiences had last seen him, he more than held his own with the film's leads, Peter Finch and Chips Rafferty.
It's the last time. If you try any more of these tricks, you'll get 14 days FP.
FP.
I'll give you 2 minutes to get back to the barber shop.
Always kidding. Always clowning acting out. He doesn't really mean that, you know.
Well, you'd better get back to the shop, son. You'll get yourself into trouble. We're glad you're still with us anyway. Have some fun.
Well, I had to go anyhow, didn't I?
You're all right, George. And see you later, George.
At the end of the war, George Jr. emerged with a family of his own. and a career as a comedian. Trained as a commercial artist, Junior was destined to return to the stage his father had reared him on. Their comic similarities were there for all to see.
Of course they were similar, you know, being father and son, you know, and he was influenced by his father. He wanted to be like his father. He, you know, wanted to be a funny man. He wanted to be able to play piano, and he also wanted to be able to draw and paint like his father.
When people say that Dad moved to Queensland because he was so jealous of his father, you know what I mean? And there was this like rivalry between the two of them. I find that a contradiction in terms because of the fact that grandfather helped Dad at the beginning of his career so much by giving him, you know, gags and scripts.
He gave Dad a few breaks, you know, by having a couple of bit parts in movies. But I think that he knew that Dad had a lot of potential on his own, and I think he just let him go his natural way.
You know, we haven't seen young George here, but we believe he's quite a chip off the old block.
Oh, you mean Junior? Yes, he's a very clever writer. He's a very accomplished musician, and he has the makings of a very, very good comic. He's up at the Theatre Royal in Brisbane at present, you know. And I said to him, how long do you contemplate staying there? He said, oh, I guess we'll be there about 12 weeks. Well, I think over this month, he's in the 5th month of his 4th year. He's a remarkably clever boy. I think he gets it from his mother.
While George Jr. worked on stage, George Sr. moved to radio. After World War II, the Tivoli circuit was again dominated by imported acts, and radio proved the salvation of many Australian performers. George conquered the airwaves with his national radio show, but the move was not entirely satisfactory.
And how do you like this radio game?
Oh, well, I mean to say, when you've been bred and born in vaudeville like I have, it's not quite up to vaudeville. You don't get that spontaneous response that you do from the stage, you know.
George's final film appearance was in 1950, again as comic relief in the film Wherever She Goes, the story of Australian pianist Eileen Joyce.
Look, I was just standing up there, that's all I was doing. Shh. She sneaked behind my back. Shh.
One of just 2 films made in Australia that year, it did nothing to revive a stagnant film industry. Disheartened by the limited work options, George took a gamble. He booked a passage to England, knowing that this would be his last chance at international success. Here he is, a huge star in Australia, comes to England completely unknown, and a very sick man.
He did his act at the Nuffield Centre. He did Sophie the Sword on the Bus. Now, this was a sketch, of course, that relied so much on the Australian vernacular.
You know, I'm a girl who likes refinement and culture and music. I always try to act like a lady, speak like a lady, always be the perfect lady. I'm having a stink with a sailor in a fish shop the other night.
He died. Nobody came into the theatre, and those that did just sat there and sat in their hands and didn't laugh or applaud. He left his run too late.
He was sick, so sick. Don, my husband, you know, he said he's pathetic. That's what Don said. He's pathetic, that it's sort of like let himself down because he was ill. Because I don't think he'd ever been as ill as he was at that time. You know, he's always had this chest and his hemorrhoids. He just said, I think I came the wrong time, mate.
He went into a sort of deep depression and illness in the hotel where he was staying. Helen Pavitt, who worked at the hotel, looked out for him to make sure that he ate properly and had medical attention. And he persuaded her to come back to Australia as his housekeeper to look after him.
We visited him quite a lot at his home in Kensington. I used to go in with Mum and Dad and Jeff, and he was there with Helen. But all around the house, there was just hundreds of paintings, and they lined the corridors, and they're all stacked up in the kitchen and everywhere. And I loved his paintings. And every time we went there and visited him, I'd go up to him and I'd say, "Grandfather, can I have one of your paintings?" And he'd say, "Come here, speak up." And he was really quite ill and coughing, but he still had a lot of humour. And I'd walk up to him and I'd say, "Can I have one of your paintings?" He'd say, "Are you giving me cheek?" And I'd say, "No." And he'd say, "Bye, G," and he'd do this mock getting up off the kitchen. "Bye, G, if you're giving me cheek, I'll get you." And the same rich, I'd run up the corridor laughing, and this went on every time we visited them.
After a period of convalescence, George's luck changed. Devastated and embarrassed by his failure in England, a subject he was reluctant to talk about, he needed a boost of confidence. And it came in the form of a series of lavish nostalgia shows.
Well, I met George in a production of The Good Old Days for Harry Wren in about 1957. He used to say, "We've got a captive audience out there." He said, our job is to go out and take them by the hand and take them on a journey and make sure they enjoy it, you know. I remember once when he said to me, "Let's go out and grab these poor bastards and make them happy, eh?" Which I thought was a lovely attitude to have.
The Good Old Days was the most successful of the nostalgia shows, touring Australia and New Zealand for a rigorous 12 months. Its success confirmed George's continued popularity with audiences on both sides of the Tasman.
I was 16 and privileged to work with him for a few weeks when he replaced his son at Theatre Royal. I was very excited because George Wallace Sr. Said that his ex-wife was coming that day. Anyway, she arrives at the front door. I was expecting to see a grandmother. There is this woman looking like Marlene Dietrich. She looked about 28 or 30. And George Wallace just had the biggest smile on his face. It was just incredible.
We were friends right through. I'd sneak out with him, even when I was married to this other man. He used to say, "Can't treat you the same as I treat other people. Too precious." No, I was very fond of him. I still am.
Now in his 60s, George continued to perform both on stage and in early television shows. But his bronchitis, now accompanied by an unshakable wheeze, was making things difficult.
George Wallace Jr. was leaving Theatre Royal in Brisbane to join a show in Sydney, and Senior was coming in. And Junior stayed to see the matinee. And we all sort of knew that his father really wasn't getting across the footlights, but anyway, Junior came in at interval, and I was in the wings, and Junior came up, put his arms around his dad and said, "Pop, you are just wonderful." And I'd worked with George Jr. for 3 years, and it was the first time I saw him crying.
The last time I saw George was sitting in the kitchen of his house in Randwick, and Helen, my mother, Auntie Annie, was there, and he was very disconnected through the whole scene, and he suddenly looked up from all this domesticity and said to me, looking at me with those great basset hound eyes of his, and said, "Did you ever see me work?" And I said, "Of course, you're terrific." And that pleased him a lot.
Crowds arrive for the funeral of George Wallace, comedian of stage, films, radio and TV. His son George Wallace Jr. and Dinks Patterson, his partner 41 years ago. Today they remember a great comedian, and the world of the theatre is the poorer now that he has taken his last bow.
Yes, he was really dedicated. He lived for the theatre. He knew nothing else but the theatre.
Mick and I, we liked him better than anyone we have ever known, I think.
You only had to look at George Wallace and you had to laugh. You had to give a grin, you had to give a smile.
I want to know, who is your nearest relative? Oh, who's my nearest relation? Exactly. Mother and father about the same distance. Everybody happy?
Yes, Your Majesty.
Everything peaceful?
Very, very peaceful, Your Majesty.
Oh, good. We'll have a war. But, Your Majesty. No arguments, we'll have a war. We'll pick out some nation about our own weight and we'll belt the tar out of it.
Yeah, anytime you want any help, you know where the station is, don't you?
Yeah.
Good night. Good night.
And they shot Ned Kelly.
Well, it's been all right for me. I've got no kick. I've had a good time. Made a few pennies to put in the piggy bank. Had a lot of fun and all that.